We should get started, and I would like to welcome you all to the public lecture, and thank you everybody that has come to join us. And I know that we have quite a good signing up on the online, and we welcome all the colleagues that have signed up online. We do have 2 or 3 types of seminars for those that are joining us for the first time. We do have the Tuesday and Thursday seminars for our fellows, presenting to the fellows and justifying why they should be part of the cohort. And so those normally take place at STIAS, and of course the fellows are invited to invite their colleagues to those seminars. And then we have the second category, which is the public lecture, and we do have 3 public lectures per semester, and we try and vary them according to the program, the fellowship programs that we have, taking care of the humanities, the natural physical sciences, and also the young scholars. So we get that breadth, and so for those that are fortunate or unfortunate to be selected to present public lectures, it's also based on the fact that STIAS wants to show to the public the breadth and wealth of the fellowship that we have at STIAS. And the honors this time fell on Irus here. And so she's carrying not just the burden of her scholarly work, but also the burden of showing what we have at STIAS. No pressure intended. And then, of course, the third type is where we have more sort of workshop types where fellows either present their scholarly work in books that have just been, that have just come out and so forth. And so we hope that increasingly we can show, especially the environment within which we are situated, that we are worth to be called an Institute for Advanced Study. Having said that, what we do with the public lectures is, to the extent possible, we ask a colleague outside of the Institute to introduce the public lecture speaker. And for today, we had asked a colleague from the Department of Sociology and Social Anthropology to come and present. But since I hold also a position as Professor Extraordinary at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Stellenbosch University, I think I can present Irus, not just as a director of the Institute, but also as a Professor Extraordinary at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. So in that respect, then, it's my pleasure to introduce the speaker this afternoon. And the speaker, Irus Braverman, is going to speak on settling nature, the conservation regime in Palestine, Israel. And she reminds me of the first time I went to Israel about 15 years ago, and we're having this project that was dealing with, of all things, sexual and reproductive health, and looking at the combination in that. So I'm really looking forward to the work that she's going to present in that respect. But before we do that, again, as we do usually, we make some announcements, and I would like to welcome 2 Isolomso fellows, both of whom are joining us for their final residency. And so we have Claudia Gastro from the Department of Anthropology and Development Studies at the University of Joburg. She's right there. I didn't know that shyness was part of you. Okay, there she is. And she's working on everyday authoritarianism, urban life, and politics in Rwanda, Angola. The next one is James Ochita. He actually arrived last night, so I don't know whether he's here. But James Ochita is from the Department of Literature at Makerere University, and he's working on a project dealing with mobility, subjectivity, and the poetics of space making in the Western Indian Ocean novels. So welcome to our two colleagues that have been here for a number of residencies, and we are wishing you the last residency to be as memorable as it can be so that you can come back. Now, if I may turn to Professor Irus Braverman. She is a professor of law and adjunct professor of geography at the University at Buffalo. I never understood why they don't say University of Buffalo, and they say University at Buffalo in New York. And she's also a William J. McGovern Faculty Scholar. And her research focus is on animal studies, nature and conservation biology, law and geography, law and genetics, legal ethnography, law and society, as well as science and technology studies, and I think again from a legal perspective. She had her PhD or SGD from the University of Toronto, and she did her MA and LLB at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And so I think that's where she started also being interested. So even when she's been mobile, she's actually remained grounded in that particular field. She's also a practicing lawyer, in case some of you have cases, or she used to practice those times. And she was an attorney as in the Israeli Union for Environmental Defense, and also a state prosecutor in the district attorney's office. But I think she's forgotten. Totally, that's what she's saying. So no cases to her, please. I was looking up some of the work that she's done, and there is a monograph, actually now it's a book that has come out, and I hope that you talk to it in her presentation, on settling nature, the politics of conservation in Palestine, Israel, by the University of Minnesota Press. And I've seen some of the reviews, and I hope that she will be able to give us a sense in that direction. There is also another one, the 2021 on zoo veterinarians governing care on a diseased planet. It's quite an interesting topic, and I would really encourage that colleagues read it. She's a member of the Ethics, Legal, and Social Issues Subcommittee of the Earth Biogenome Project, and also a member of the International Society for Reef Studies, and member of Society for Literature, Society, and the Arts, as well as a member of the Association of American Geographers. But most importantly, she's a fellow of STIAS during this cohort. And on that basis, I would like to invite you to come and speak to us. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming here. I'm very honored, very humbled to see so many faces that I know and that I don't know. And the grand entrance, right? And thank you, Edward, for that introduction. So I'm amazed how you can put things together so quickly. Thank you so much for doing that. Thank you, STIAS, for the wonderful hospitality. It's been such an honor being here. I know I speak for my daughter as well, who's joined me for this adventure. Unfortunately, my son couldn't be here because he's doing high school exams, so he's still in New York. And thanks to my fellows who have been so supportive and engaging. during this time. So I would like to share with you today, actually I'm exactly going to talk about the forthcoming book. It's not out yet. It's called Settling Nature, the Conservation Regime in Palestine, Israel. It's forthcoming with the University of Minnesota Press. It is my 7th monograph, and it's probably been the hardest one I've ever written, and I'll probably go into why that's the case today. So it's kind of a daunting task for me to present a decade-long project in about 50 to 55 minutes, but I'm going to give it my best and might be reading more than I wanted to, just in order to make sure to fit it all in. All right, so I wanted to begin with a video. And perfect.
Griffon vulture, and a mother, and a member of a species so endangered she's tagged. But tragically, soon after these pictures were taken, she died when she flew into power cables. The conservationists who set up this Nest camera knew that the father left behind would not be able to rear their one chick on his own. And so a savior was sought and found. Called Mother Drone, it's been dropping food onto the cliff face ledge every 2 or 3 days. The use of...
But we're going to skip ahead.
It was a special Israeli army unit that actually conducted these unique stealthy feeding missions. The major in command, who cannot be identified, told me that to prepare they built an indoor mock-up of the ledge and nest and spent hours practicing on it before starting food drops for real. The chick has discovered that there's no such thing as a free lunch, but it's been able to fight off thieves and to grow thanks to the food provided by its father and by Mother Drone. The collaboration between the army, the tech company, and the conservationists got the ultimate endorsement this week when the chick flew for the first time. Job done. John Irvine.
All right. So, what does this saving of the Griffon vulture chick have to do with politics and with settler colonialism, which is the focus of my talk today? So I showed this clip to my students in New York, my graduate students in the law school, and they were surprised, they were shocked. What does the Army have to do with conservation, and what is it doing there? And then it was my turn to be shocked, because it didn't even occur to me to ask that question. Growing up in Israel and living there until I was probably in my mid-30s, I've become normalized to the very intimate connections between military and nature. And so those have become invisible in my eyes, well, almost invisible. So I think that that's exactly kind of my point here, that the power of nature is precisely in its naturalness, in the sense of invisibility of this power. And so this is why I also call it this conservation regime. So the main argument in my project is that nature management is much more central to the settler colonial project than is commonly recognized. More specifically, I claim that the administration of nature advances the Zionist project of Jewish settlement alongside the corresponding dispossession of non-Jews, specifically Palestinians, from this space. So my work examines two interrelated strategies, or I'll call them technologies, for settlement and dispossession. The first technology is territorial and relatively static, and occurs through the designation of parks and reserves and their protection as such. And the second is biopolitical and more versatile, and occurs through the protection of certain animal and plant bodies. So the protection on the one hand, and also restrictions and even extermination of other organisms that are deemed problematic for the settler mission. This second strategy often exceeds the boundaries of the protected territories. And the griffin vulture that I showed you will come back to feature toward the end of this talk. So keep that hanging. So these two forms of dispossession, through sovereign power and through biopolitics, lean on and support one another in a way that I refer to as settler ecologies. And I argue in a nutshell that settler ecologies perpetuate violence to all forms of life, both human and non-human, and that such instances of violence across the more than human spectrum are not only co-produced, but also exacerbate one another. So we will see some of the examples when I tell you some of the stories about the violences that occur to both human and non-human organisms. So a few words about the methodology that I undertook here. As a legal ethnographer and as a geographer, my research mostly relies on in-depth interviews and participant observations. So like I said, I've been working on this project for at least a decade, if not from probably when I was really young. So you kind of, grow in this environment. But most of the research was drawing on about 70 to 100 at this point interviews, in-depth interviews with officials from the Israel Nature and Parks Authority, or what is also called INPA. So Israel Nature and Parks Authority, and from now on I'm going to call them INPA. Or I'll try to. INPA is the central state agency administering nature in Israel. And so they have been the officials that I spoke with most, and this is one of the reasons that this project has not been easy. So on the one hand, I have been deeply committed to nature conservation and very much aware of the fraught moment in which we live. Conservation is important, especially in the current polarized political climate and with the strong capitalist interests at play. Only this week, US President Biden granted the formal approval to a huge oil drilling project in Alaska, while lands in Murchison Falls National Park in Uganda are being cleared to prepare for the East African crude oil pipeline. And so it is important that I make clear at the outset that my intention with this project is to bolster and not jeopardize the important efforts of conservationists to protect wildlife and their habitats in this region and beyond. And then there's my close relationship with some of my interlocutors, with the Israeli conservation professionals. And as Edward said, I did work as a lawyer, it feels like many lifetimes ago, really honestly, 20, 30 years ago. And I actually got to know some of these people, so some of them we go back 20, 30 years. And so this is why I also want to make clear that my arguments here are by no means personal. So they're not about one person or the others. These officials, most if not all of them, are highly motivated, extremely dedicated to wildlife protection. Many of them are also against the occupation. And so my point is that we're talking about a problem that is not personal, but is structural. All right. So the territorial nature, the first part of my project here, the first aspect, the first avenue, the territorial aspect is remarkable. So we're talking about national parks and nature reserves that are designated in about 25% of the country, as you can see on those green blotches. And this process is quickly accelerating. In 2020, then Israel right-wing defense minister, later prime minister, not the one that is now in power, but Naftali Bennett, declared 7 new nature reserves. I can't believe that we can miss Naftali Bennett, but I guess this is where we are at if you're following the Israeli news now. Anyway, Naftali Bennett declared 7 new nature reserves and expanded 12 others. Approximately 40% of these reserves are located on lands privately owned by Palestinians. Bennett announced during the designation ceremony, and I'm quoting, "We will continue to develop the Jewish settlement in Judea and Samaria." This single, very explicit statement encapsulates the intimate relationship between the conservation of natural habitats and the takeover of land for Jewish settlement. So basically, in the designation ceremony, he is saying that, that it is for the purpose of developing Jewish settlement. So quite an explicit statement. The state of Israel boasts a stunning number of nature reserves and national parks. We're talking about 530 nature reserves and parks. Here, for example, just so you get a sense of the landscape, Masada, the baptism site on the Jordan River, another one of the baptism site, Nebi Samuel, and Caesarea. Compare this number, 530 national parks and reserves, with the number in South Africa, which I don't know how many of you know national parks, roughly 20 national parks in the entire South Africa, which is 55 times larger than Palestine, Israel. So Palestine, Israel is about the size of Kruger Park, just so you get a comparison, right? Let me make clear that I'm not saying that all the national parks and the nature reserves were designated for the single purpose of dispossessing Palestinians and promoting Jewish settlement. What I am saying is that the element of dispossession has been central to this project and has largely been disregarded in the literature, especially when it comes to what is called 1948 Israel. So basically, Israel within the Green Line, or the internationally recognized border of 1948. As far as I'm aware, this is the first comprehensive study of the state of Israel's nature conservation project through a settler colonial lens. But Israel is certainly not the only country that has used nature reserves and parks for the dispossession of local, native, and indigenous populations. Indigenous peoples were systematically eliminated by the state from national parks in the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and from European colonies in Africa and in Latin America. In his book, Whiteness in Zimbabwe, anthropologist David McDermott Hughes argued that parks and other conservation areas symbolize the era of European conquest. Environmental historian Jane Carruthers similarly highlighted in her work on South Africa's national parks that, and I'm quoting, national parks remain playgrounds for whites. She cites from Nelson Mandela, who wrote, "Many of our protected areas have their origins in the colonial past, and there's a legacy of alienation from the local people who were excluded from enjoying them or benefiting from them in any way." Finally, Michael Suckup and Gary Mackless, who the latter served as the science advisor to the director of the U.S. National Park Service, documented in the U.S. context, and I'm again quoting, "in the process of creating nearly every national park." This is from the person who was the science advisor to the director of the National Park Service. In the process of creating every national park, Native American rights to ownership were ignored and invalidated as these populations were pushed from their ancestral homelands. To be sure, projects of elimination of Native populations also took place outside the so-called natural areas and in other contexts than that of wildlife protection. But those are not my focus here. So what happens when the state designates land for nature protection? Typically, this land is going to be subject to numerous restrictions. So if the land is privately owned, typically there's going to be restrictions on cultivation and on access from the local community. And since Israel is not actually appropriating the land, then the local community will not get usually compensation for this act of designation. Of the hundreds of parks and reserves in Palestine, Israel, my work relays in greater detail. I'll show you the Mount Meron Nature Reserve up in the north. So this is a nature reserve that is in 1948, in the area of 1948 Israel within the Green Line. Then there's Silwan and Walaja in the Jerusalem area in the center. In Hebrew, that's the city of David and Rephaim Stream National Park, if you can see those. And then, maybe I can hover the mouse. And then Nahal Kana Nature Reserve, or Wadi Kana, which is in the occupied Palestinian territories according to international law, and so it is administered by the Israeli military. Here are several photos from those nature reserves and national parks that I just mentioned. So this is Beit Jan. It's a Druze, non-Jewish village in the northern part, as I said, in the Galilee. And so 20% of this nature reserve, of Mount Meron Nature Reserve, is on private Palestinian land and encircles the village so it actually cannot grow and expand. This is a Druze cultivating his land in the nature reserve. There's whole stories about that, but I'm not going to go into that. And then I'm moving swiftly through Jerusalem that has the largest number of national parks in this smaller urban area. This is from Mount Olives, looking from the east into the western part of Jerusalem. And here is Silwan, or the city of David, and Walaja on the hilltop on the left, and here a better image of Walaja with the separation wall that you can see right underneath it, and the terraces, Palestinian terraces that kind of line the mountain, and that INPA is very much in favor of as the landscape of our forefathers, as some call it. So lastly, these are some images from Wadi Kana, from Nahal Kana Nature Reserve in the occupied territory, in Area C of the occupied territory. Now, Area C of the occupied territory, and I'm sorry for all this jargon, right, but it's just a very complicated political mess that we have there. So Area C was part of the Oslo Accords of the 1990s, and it is about 61%, or not about, exactly 61% of the territory, and the majority of Area C has been designated as natural parks and as nature reserves and national parks. More generally, over half of the reserves and parks in the entire space are designated also as military zones. So you can see the block of concrete declaring this a military zone, and here perhaps more clearly on the left the designation of the nature reserve, on the right the military zone, and that means that people are even less able to access these lands and definitely to cultivate them when it's also a military reserve, a military and a nature reserve. All right. So in addition to these acts of green grabbing, as some call them, the Israeli settlers also perform acts of, as I call them, blue grabbing, and we're talking about the appropriation of springs. This is a massive project of appropriation. Most of the springs are situated within nature reserves and national parks. So here are a few examples. This is Ein Kilt, right near Jericho. This is in Hebron, and the graffiti says the spring of Abraham, or in the background, the reserve of our forefathers' estate, with a soldier making sure that the right people can access and the wrong people can't. And OCHA of the United Nations reported that at least 55 Palestinian springs are at risk of settler takeover. Here is one page from that list. So a few words about the scholarship that I engage with in this project. So this scholarship includes the emergent literature on settler colonialism in Palestine and elsewhere, critical animal studies, environmental humanities, and specifically environmental history, and political ecology. Just a few words about settler colonialism, that the scholarship asserts, in a nutshell, that the settler societies aim to dispossess and replace the native inhabitants, thereby allowing the settlers to view themselves as the new native and legitimizing their territorial claims. So one of the prominent scholars in this tradition, Australian scholar Patrick Wolfe, highlighted two central elements of settler colonialism: territoriality and elimination. He also emphasized that settler colonialism is a structure and not an event, as I pointed out earlier. For him, the logic of elimination, or genocide, is what distinguishes settler colonialism from more classical forms of colonialism, if you will, which are premised instead on exploitation. My project challenges this rigid divide between elimination and exploitation, and I say that they actually go hand in hand. Still, the settler colonial framework even the traditional one is very helpful for my project. It illuminates and explains the importance of territoriality, the end goal of the natives' elimination, and finally, it situates this project within a broader context, which promotes alliances between Palestinians and other indigenous communities. Using this framework also reveals one more thing that's really important to me, and that is the deep interconnections between 1948 Israel and the occupied territories of 1967. Now, much of the international criticism toward Israel is the occupation, and a lot of you may have heard about the occupied territories, so a lot focus on that space. But what I claim here is that the problem is not just the 1967 occupation, but that instead, Israel's settler ecologies operate on both sides of the Green Line, and that one unitary settler colonial regime governs both spaces. This has also been the stance of Amnesty International. This is pretty recent, of Human Rights Watch, and lastly of the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem. And all of these organizations have recently, in the past couple of years, defined the Israeli regime on both sides of the Green Line, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, as apartheid. So we might want to talk about that later. Up to this point, I discussed the sovereign enclosure of land and springs in the form of protected nature reserves and parks. So now is the time to tell you more about animals and about fauna and flora, but mostly about fauna. This is a less visible form of dispossession than the more typical land appropriation, and so I would like to dedicate the rest of my talk today to understanding the intricate ways in which this dispossession through animal warfare happens. So I will try to tell you today stories about fallow deer, wild asses, camels, goats, goldfinches, and finally circling back to the vultures. Since its early days, the Zionist state promoted a strong affinity with wild animals, and especially with animals that could be traced back to the Bible. The mountain gazelle features up front, if you're wondering. At the same time, the Palestinians have come to be associated with what Israel has configured as so-called problem species: black goats, camels, olives, hybrid goldfinches, and feral dogs. Precisely because they are not typically perceived as soldiers in human wars, when flora and fauna are deployed for ecological warfare, their alignment on one side or the other becomes that much more powerful. In fact, ecological warfare is not even considered a conflict at all, but it seems like part of the natural order of things. Indian writer Amitav Ghosh, who we've kind of discussed in prior sessions, writes in this context, and I'm quoting from his, I think, latest book, The Nutmeg's Curse. Wars of extermination were precisely biopolitical wars in which the weaponization of the environment was a critical element of the conflict. He explains that indigenous peoples faced a state of permanent war that involved many kinds of other than human beings and entities. Pathogens, rivers, forests, plants, and animals all played a part in the struggle. This is the first director of INPA, Israel Nature and Parks Authority. His name is Avraham Yoffe. He was a retired military general who then served as INPA director for 18 years. And he was also a hunter. So this is possibly why he was very dedicated to the project of reintroducing into the landscape extirpated species mentioned in the Bible, mostly charismatic ones that could then be hunted as well, right? And this is what he said: the Zionists wanted to bring Jews back to Israel. I wanted to bring animals not on 2 feet, but on 4. So the Persian fallow deer was the crown of Israel's reintroduction projects and still is. Here we go. This is the Persian fallow deer. This is one of the rarest deer species in the world. Now, just a word about what reintroductions are. So this is the professional term used, defined by the IUCN, for the act of reestablishing a viable population of a species within its so-called indigenous range. Okay. So the fallow deer, who was mentioned in the Bible, was considered extinct around the world by the 1940s. But then they found 12 of those animals in Iran. So Israel then embarked on a secret mission to save the fallow deer from Iran and deliver them back to Israel before the collapse of the Iranian government. 1978, 4 fallow deer were loaded onto the last El Al flight out of Tehran. As it happens, the 4 fallow deer were all female. So what to do? They found 2 males in the Opel Zoo in Germany, and these 6 animals became the founders of the entire population of fallow deer that now includes, in 2021, includes 300 deer in the wild and 2 populations in captivity. The deer are still being reintroduced on a regular basis. Oh, here's the Wall Street Journal's news. All right. So here are some photos that I shot in a reintroduction. I think this was in 2018. On the left is the Biblical Zoos veterinarian, Nili Avni Magan, and this is the reintroduction moment. The deer are introduced in a soft reintroduction for the conservationists among you into fenced areas at this point. And let me say that even this was a lot for the deer. They kind of preferred to stay with Nili in the zoo. They were not very happy about their newfound freedom. All right, so here's the list of reintroduction numbers. If the fallow deer is the crown of Israel's reintroduction project in the north, the wild ass is the crown or the king of the south. Like the fallow deer, the wild ass was also considered a biblical species and was flown as well to Israel from Iran. The reintroduction into the Nakab Desert, or the Negev, this is the part that you see down in the south of the country in kind of dark yellow. It began and stopped 5 years after it began because they were doing so well in the wild that they didn't need any more infusion of new blood. So the wild ass reintroduction is considered a huge success around the world, worldwide. The population now numbers over 300 individuals and counting. All right, now the story gets a bit more complicated when we introduce this court case. 2017, INPA presses criminal charges against this person. He's a Bedouin, his name is Salman Sadan, and he's a Palestinian citizen of Israel. What is his crime, you will ask? He allowed his camels to graze in the Negev Mountain Nature Reserve, which is one of the central habitats of the reintroduced wild asses. He was also charged for allowing his camels to drink the precious water intended for the asses. If you don't believe me, this is the criminal court case number, and this is the first page of the indictment. Now, camels have lived in the Middle East for about 3,000 years. Alongside their ecological significance, they are also culturally important, especially for the semi-pastoral communities in this region. The attempt by Israel's nature officials to keep the camels out of the nature reserves and is really founded on this idea that conservation is about protecting nature from all humans and their respective animals. So this is also referred to as the people versus parks approach in conservation. Such a notion of pristine wilderness that is devoid of humans has figured strongly in the colonial mindset of many early national parks that saw humans and nature as separate. As part of this tradition, the African continent, as well as tropical islands, were often portrayed as an unspoiled Eden. Historian Mark David Spence writes about the first national parks in the United States that their wilderness, and I'm quoting, had to be created before it could be protected. In practice, what this meant was that local and indigenous communities had to be displaced in order to make way for wilderness. The idea that conservation is about protecting nature from all humans and their associated animals supports Israel's position that conservation is apolitical and egalitarian. So basically, it doesn't matter if it's Saddam who is entering with a camel, or even if Abraham somehow resurrected and came on his camel into the nature reserve, he would not be allowed access. So this is the egalitarian aspect. But when we look a little bit closer, we see the discriminatory nature that is at play here. Because while the wild asses are affiliated with the settler Zionist state, most of the camels in the Nakab are owned by non-Jewish Bedouin Palestinians. So this is important. Saddam's lawyer told the court, and I'm quoting, "We're not against the existence of nature protection regulations, but the policy of INPA is meant to push the Bedouins out of the reserve and not to protect nature. What bothers INPA is not that the camel entered the reserve, but that after the camel usually comes a Bedouin." I will say briefly that I don't quite agree with Michael Sfeld, because my claim exactly is that nature protection and the elimination of the native are tightly intertwined, so the policy is aimed to protect nature and eliminate Bedouins. Under settler ecologies, then, the wild ass becomes a technology for altering the desert landscape back to an imaginary Jewish past that does not contain Bedouins, whose very presence is like a thorn in the Zionist imaginary of an empty land, or terra nullius. For the landscape to reappear in this wild imaginary, the Bedouins and the domestic animals that have come to be associated with their lifestyle must therefore be carefully exterminated, eliminated from the natural landscape of this place. This is the Green Patrol. This is a special paramilitary unit that operates under INPA, but serves all of Israel's land agencies, strictly enforcing this conservation regime in 1948 Israel. Another way that Israel criminalizes camels is through discourses about safety. After a few fatal crashes that involved camels, in 2018, the Israeli Knesset, or the Israeli parliament, passed a law with the goal of improving road safety. Under this new law, camel owners must now register their animals in the state's database and bear criminal responsibility for the injuries and damages their animals cause. Not unlike their camels, many Bedouins, despite being citizens of Israel, live under the constant threat of house demolitions, since their villages are unrecognized by the state. Israel's hostility toward the camels reminds of another animosity that came quite a few years beforehand between the state of Israel and the black goat. So in the mid-20th century, the black goats were by far the largest group of domesticated animals in Palestine and the main producers of milk in the region, going back hundreds of years. Perceived as devastating the natural ecosystem and the massive afforestation project of the Jewish National Fund in particular, the Palestinians' goat herding practices were targeted by the British and later by Israel as a criminal offense. The Plant Protection Act of 1950, which is more accurately called the Black Goat Act, is explicitly dedicated to the extermination of the black goat from the landscape. The 1948 war already saw a major decline in the black goat population in the region. Estimated at 750,000 goats before the war, the numbers dropped sevenfold. Eerily similar, I will add, to the rate of decline in the Palestinian population during the same period. The Black Goat Act was meant to finish the job on both fronts. Eliminating the goat was folded together with eliminating the native who relied on the goat. Only several decades later, INPA recognized the huge ecological mistake. Goat grazing is a crucial element in fire management, as probably some of you know from South Africa as well. So now nature administrators are training local community how to actually herd goats, in quite an ironic twist of fate. From the goat to the European goldfinch. This bird was one of the most common birds in the Jerusalem region and is now extirpated from this area. But the captive bred hybrid goldfinch canary, also in Arabic banduk, is still around and is a highly prized pet in many Palestinian homes in Jerusalem and elsewhere. The Wild Animal Protection Act of 1955 strictly prohibits the hunting, holding, or selling of this bird. And this has resulted in illegal smuggling of non-wild goldfinches from Eastern European countries where their breeding is actually permitted into the West Bank through East Jerusalem. So here you can see some pictures that I shot in the market in East Jerusalem with the cages displayed of illegally trafficked songbirds displayed openly. This was during a holy day, and so most of the market is closed, but these shops are open. And here in the left-hand corner of the photo. The INPA officials I interviewed portrayed the Palestinian affinity with birds as criminal, backward, and greedy. I recorded statements like they're freaks of anything illegal, and they don't really love the birds, but use them as a status symbol, just like they use their wives. In the name of bird protection, then, Israel's Nature Authority generates disrespect and mistrust toward what are then configured as the inhumane and uncivilized behaviors of Palestinians toward animals. This is the Allenby border crossing. It's usually closed to Israelis, but I was visiting there with the nature officials, so they allowed me in. And when I visited there in 2019, I met an inspector from the Ministry of Agriculture who showed me graphic images of birds in poor conditions after they had been smuggled in various luggage and clothing arrangements, inside pants, in cigarette cases, and on vests fitted on young children or pregnant women to avoid detection through the automated detectors, electronic detectors. The more sophisticated our research methods become, the further sophisticated their methods get, the inspector told me. So I mentioned the increased violence toward humans and non-humans and the slippages between the two. Such an escalation of violence between traffickers and state inspectors and rangers is characteristic of what is called green wars, as some have referred to the increasing militarization of violence inflicted in the name of nature protection. So some of you might have in mind rhino poaching in Kruger Park, and indeed there are political ecologists who have written and depicted what's called an arms race between poachers and anti-poaching forces. This can be problematic, these political ecologists offer, because successful conservation management requires the support of local communities rather than their alienation. Coming back to the trafficked goldfinches at the Jordan-Israel border, the songbirds who survived the journey and entered into Israel were confiscated promptly and moved to this quarantine facility. So this is kind of where Israel was keeping the trafficked birds, but they weren't allowed to release them into the wild out of the fear that they will contaminate the local species, so they had to kill them. They killed them using poisonous gas. But for the Jewish Israeli public, using poisonous gas to kill living organisms triggered post-traumatic responses that resulted in massive public pressure to stop the gassing. So arguably, the Israeli public understood what I'm trying to claim here, that there are slippages between human and animal worlds, and that the pathways through which violence travels kind of inevitably seeps between these worlds. Okay, in the remaining time I have today, I promised you to get back to the vulture. And through the vulture to speak about the relationship between nature and militarism. So the vulture is one of the flag conservation projects in Israel, one of its most ambitious projects to date. There are two main reasons that the Israeli conservationists have been focusing on the vulture. Well, first is kind of in the photo, right? An amazing physical presence, very charismatic, 10 feet or about 2 to 3 meters of wingspan. And also it's mentioned in the Bible. Add to this the dramatic decline in the vulture's numbers due to electrocution, inadvertent poisoning, and habitat loss, and you have all the ingredients for a powerful conservation story. Thousands of vultures filled the skies in this region going back to the previous century. During the 1980s, their numbers shrunk. And in the 1980s, there were about 75 breeding pairs, a drop of 95% in the numbers. So in the 1990s, INPA designed a captive breeding program for the vultures. The idea was to coax the vultures into producing more eggs in the wild than to take those eggs and rear those in captivity, and I could not resist, after all the horrible images before, to include some of these images of these chicks. And now the conservationists were concerned about imprinting the birds in ways that would limit their release into the wild, so the managers were walking around with these Fimo puppets to feed the chicks so they don't get imprinted by the humans and think that the humans are their mothers, right? The captive birds are first taught to fly in these flying cages, and then they're released to bolster the declining wild population. There are currently 220 vultures in Palestine, Israel, making the Vulture Project a huge success story. About 80% of the birds are monitored by GPS, and this becomes really important. So here's how the GPS looks like. Here are some of the guidelines for how to attach the devices, if you want to know. And here's a digital system that uses algorithms from movement ecology to alert rangers in real time when the vultures move in certain ways that indicate that they're in danger, and then the rangers are dispatched immediately to the scene, and are there within minutes, they told me. So Israeli nature officials like to say that the love of birds has no flags, has no politics, has no borders, and that as a result of this, bird conservation also can bridge borders and make peace. As you can see in this image of Israel's GPS monitoring project, Israel's vulture conservation project certainly has no borders in the sense that it exceeds the sovereign space of Israeli territory into northern and eastern Africa and Saudi Arabia. Here's another image that shows it, depicts it all the way down to Sudan and Eritrea. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the slogan "Birds Know No Borders" is often interpreted by Israel's neighboring countries as a green pretext for Zionist imperial control. These countries have therefore not always seen Israel's intensive management of birds too favorably. In 2011, Saudi Arabia detained an Israeli vulture for spying. The vulture was carrying a GPS transmitter with the inscription Tel Aviv University, which prompted rumors that he was, or she, a Mossad agent. In 2016, another griffon vulture was detained in Lebanon, and dolphins were also suspect. INPA officials dismissed all of these claims, calling them ludicrous Arab fantasies. Now, accusations about spying missions aside, birds have been central to Israel's military in several ways. In fact, Israel's military, and its Air Force in particular, have over the years developed a totemic relationship with birds. It all started by accident, as a lot of things do. After Israel withdrew from the massive region of Sinai, where it was training in both land and air, its air training space shrunk. And as a result, it had to basically train in a much smaller space, which coincided, as it happens, with one of the largest bird migrations in the world, with 500 million birds flying over this space annually. So this is on the migration, this path is on the migration route between Europe, Africa, and Asia. So the Air Force started to lose pilots and jets. And indeed, the Israeli force lost 11 fighter jets as a result of bird collisions in 3 decades. I don't think I said that already, right? All right. So Concerned about this loss, massive loss in pilots, in jets, maybe also in birds, the army approached the Israeli ornithologist to map the birds' migration routes. And so he did. Take care, we share the air, it said. So soon this project developed into a model for air forces worldwide in how to continue to fly jets alongside birds. While the Army's initial study on birds emerged out of the pragmatic need to separate the sky, it would soon evolve into a much deeper engagement. So perhaps you can tell from these posters about the military aircraft that are portrayed alongside the birds they are named after. These are posters made by the Israeli Air Force. The Israeli ornithologist that I mentioned before explained to me as follows: the army, at least in Israel, is the army of the nation. It is not just killing and shooting and fighting the enemy. If you want to have soldiers who protect the nation and understand why they're fighting, you have to know its nature. It's the same as dating. To love someone, you have to know them. It's exactly the same. All right. The analogy between knowing the nation's land and wildlife and knowing a lover points to the intimacies between nature, militarism, and the settler state. Children and soldiers both participate in educational acts of knowing and protecting the land and its wildlife. This then is not just an environmental enterprise, nor is it solely about land or even the animals and plants who dwell on it. It is additionally about the instrumentalization of nature for advancing the Zionist mission, a way to strengthen the ties between the state, its land and creatures, and the Jewish children who will eventually become soldiers and finally serve both the state and its nature. As for the others in this region, mainly the Palestinians, they are typically barred from similarly serving the state and its nature and are therefore not exposed to nor allowed to participate in this intimate encounter. So it's time to wrap up, and I'd like to emphasize my central thesis again, that nature conservation and the protection of territory and of lively bodies in particular are deployed by the settler state to dispossess local and indigenous communities, while at the same time naturalizing the settler as the new native. I argued today that settler ecologies proceed through two avenues, the one focused on the sovereign enclosure of land and the other on the protection of species. And although my book pays more or less equal attention to each form of dispossession, here I really focused on the biopolitical front, on the stories about mostly animals. And as I described, the fallow deer, the gazelles, wild asses, and griffon vultures are recruited by the state of Israel to fight on the Israeli side in an ecological warfare against the goats, camels, and hybrid goldfinches who are aligned with the Palestinians. Although I didn't have time to include their stories here, I'll say quickly that plants too are recruited for this ecological warfare. Some are uprooted, like the olive tree, while others, such as the akub and the za'atar, which are edible herbs and are used widely in Palestinian cuisine, are protected by the settler state, which means that their foraging is prohibited, mostly by Palestinians. And here, children who were arrested just a couple of years ago for foraging akub. Underlying these animosities are other deeper contentions. The domestic is juxtaposed with the wild, culture with nature, and finally the native and indigenous are juxtaposed with the settler state. These juxtapositions lean on each other, reinforcing and therefore legitimizing the power and the seeming naturalness of the juxtaposed mindset that is so characteristic of settler ecologies. I will end my presentation here, and I look forward to hearing from you, especially if you'd be willing to share how this talk has resonated with your own experiences in your own political and geographic context. Thank you.
Irus, thank you so much. That was riveting and revealing and wonderful to listen to. We're going to open the floor for some discussion. Let me introduce myself first. I'm Christoph Poe. I'm the Senior Program Manager at STIAS. I want to again acknowledge and welcome everyone who joined us online. I've seen many fellows, also some of this cohort who's already had to leave, so also from earlier cohorts, and also many other friends of followers of STIAS. So thank you all for joining us. For those online, unfortunately, we can't take your questions in person, but please do post any comments and questions that you have in the chat. We do have access to the chat, and we'll draw those into a document and share that with Irus. So any questions from the room? We've got about 25 minutes to do so. I saw Bronwyn's hand first. Let's start there.
Thank you so much. I'm Bronwyn Morgan, and my question is actually picking up on from a different. So coming back to something you said at the very start about the ethnographic methods, but from a slightly different angle, it was clear from what you said about your long association, both professionally and over years as an academic, that there's some personal discomfort in navigating your argument versus the commitment of the individuals to conservation. And I guess what I'm wondering is, where ethnographically do you see, I'm trying to think, slippages or cracks, or sometimes even pathways between these different frameworks? So if you're working with people whose framework is, in their minds, conservation, your framework is settler ecology, it's not like the two are completely distinct. Are there ways in which you see those people as individuals, bridging them or wrestling with them, and does that come into the book? Obviously for the talk it sounds more like a dichotomy, but is there a sort of, does that make sense as a question?
I guess what you're asking is how to deal with, as an ethnographer, how to deal with people who don't necessarily agree with the settler colonial framework.
Yes, and what traces might there be in their words and thoughts that they might see it, but it's not just a question of agreement, but of holding dissonant frames in your own mind. And I'm speaking in a way partly from, maybe it's worth saying from personal. I grew up in Zimbabwe, and then I went and lived elsewhere, and being back at STIAS and living with the layers of different frameworks that you yourselves hold and grew up with and reject. And I just think, it's both academically interesting and biographically resonant.
Thank you. I love every opportunity to speak about ethnographic work. I think it's really important to speak about methodologies, it's very substantial. And I will say that the settler colonial framework has kind of been new to me and very productive as well. New in the sense of this scholarship, although kind of quite developed elsewhere, in Palestine has really taken, has really emerged in the last probably decade or so, maybe less. And so it also kind of shifted my mind a little bit as somebody who grew up there, who is a conservationist myself, who served in the army, who was part of a lot of these administrative structures. To see the world through this lens was very helpful in the ways that I kind of already articulated. But I will say that I think you're also right in pointing out that although it seems like a lot of the interlocutors that I was dealing with, they would probably not agree to the settler colonial framework. I've spoken a little bit with San Parks people here in South Africa, and felt like they were considering that framework. They've heard about that, and they're kind of, I don't know to what extent, but I think in a way this framework might be very disturbing for a lot of my interlocutors. And I feel, however, that when you go to actually examine some of their actions on the ground, then you get a sense that some of them are more aware of some of the aspects of settler colonialism, although not really depicting it as such. So One of the reasons I call it settler ecologies in plural is that I feel like there were a lot of approaches at play, even within this one institution called INPA, and definitely with other environmentalists as well. And some were quite critical, for example, of the occupation. And so it's very important to highlight that. Again, in some of my interactions with some of them, they might agree to some of these analyses, but then they are operating within a larger structure, as I said, Zionist settler ecology structure. And so even if personally some of their actions try to undermine this, this broader structure, then it's difficult, let's put it that way. I hope that starts to answer. But I will say I wasn't born to the world with settler colonialism written on my head either. It took me quite a few years to get to see the landscape this way. And sometimes I, too, have to make a shift into, for this framework. But I think it's a very productive one to look at when we're studying conservation. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you, Bronwyn. I've seen three further hands and a couple more in the room. Let's take those three and then I'll make sure I catch the following one. So Kopano, Sharad, and Suzanne. And I saw Andreas and Louis and Glenn as well. Perhaps, would you be comfortable taking 2 or 3 at a time?
My memory is horrible.
Let's take
I'll try to be more concise.
One at a time and we'll keep them to the point. Kopano, please.
Thanks, Crystal. Well, I found myself nodding at many points in your presentation, so thank you very much. But I don't know whether to end at a good note or a critical one. So maybe I start with a good note. Much of what you were saying is compelling and it's persuasive, and the hypothesis or the working thesis about biopolitics and governmentality and settler colonialism resonate with us a lot. And I was at the beginning at some point up until really the end, so I'm shifting to the critical. When you were mentioning, I guess this is always my interest, when you were mentioning parks around the world, you mentioned European and Western countries by name, but when you came to Africa, you said Africa several times, like 3 times, and only much later. So I was saying, this homogenizing that Africa is this unoccupied and it doesn't have countries. But I think you covered that. 2 things really I would like to ask. Absolutely, this settler colonialism framework works, particularly in ecology. But not once did I hear mention the word, because I guess people who theorize this put racism at the center, but you didn't mention it once, and I wonder why you don't do that. Because, decoloniality, colonialism mentions race, that coloniality, modernity in the 1400s, 1500s, this is the line. I mean, Anibal Cuyano says this, and you can take the history, that race sits at the part, or you can, all it's and it builds this new world, and we know it from South Africa, Israel, all over in the world. Why? Why not? Why don't you do that? Is it in the book? Half critical, half so partially critical is I think the framework you're doing has implications for all kinds of thinking around conservation around the world. And some of the problems we're seeing in South Africa, where even people you thought would understand how displacement, dispossession, taking lands from people and just capitalism just building, seem to not to appreciate this. But people are saying, well, you have to think critically from both sides. You have to think about both livelihoods as well as conservation. And so there's a possibility of offering a global critical eye around conservation and environmentalism around the world that I think maybe you want to say something more about. Yeah.
Wow, that was long, but very helpful. I think that's an excellent question about racism. So I'm an ethnographer, and I work with the material that is provided by the people that I interview. And I'll say, I think racism is clearly there. It's not mentioned explicitly. It's more mentioned as an ethnic divide, especially that Palestinians are not necessarily people of color, and Israelis are not necessarily white. And so, in fact, most of the Israeli Jews are Arab Jews, and are coming from Morocco, Iraq, Algeria, different countries. But I do think that this framework is really important, and I think it's essential for thinking about biopolitics and the value that is put on certain bodies rather than others. The notion of purity is really central when we're talking about settler ecologies. It's no coincidence that the hybrid goldfinches, they're hybrid, they can contaminate. All this discourse is very much about purity and race, if it's in the relationship to animals, and clearly it also travels to humans. And so it is definitely there. Striking a balance here as an ethnographer between things that I say in my own voice and things that are said to me has not always been easy. And so in some of the quotes, I feel like racism is there. And so I let the reader do the work of figuring that out without sticking it in their face. But I think that's an important point that I will need to consider more closely. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Kopana. Next up was Sharad.
Thanks, Irus. It was great to hear your précis of your book and look forward to it. So I have a couple of questions. One goes to ethnographic method and your choices around method, and the apology you began with, to which Bronwyn mentioned. And this is about it seems to me that when you framed your method, you talked about growing up in Israel and a little bit about your working life. Didn't realize you were in the army as well, but you have to be, right? And so, but still, so how are you giving us methodologically? How did you get at the perspectives of the colonized to understand this complicated apparatus and its contestations? And I don't know if you have Arabic and I don't know what you foregrounded the interviews and the materials that tell us something about the critique of the colonial apparatus in some way. But then, in order to make the claim that this is a biopolitical apparatus that has to draw in and make subjects in a particular way and have them consent to become subjects in a particular way, Palestinians in particular. And where's the Palestinian in this? And is it partly, does it have to go back to the question of elimination and exploitation? Is it that they're absent from the ethnographic field in a certain way because, what do you do with that? That's one thing. And then the theoretical side of this is, I'm not totally convinced that about your argument about this as a biopolitical apparatus, and biopolitical / necropolitical, obviously. What's the argument there? How does it, why frame it in that way? Much of your story, you didn't really need that, so what is it doing? How are you responding to the work on biopolitics and necropolitics? That's a small question, sorry.
Two small questions. All right. So I'm a settler myself, and so this is my positionality, as anthropologists like to say, when coming to this project. So although I do have a lot of friends, colleagues, who I consulted with and who supported this project, I have been using my own privilege as a settler in order to access what's called studying up in ethnography or insider ethnography. I have been using my privilege in order to study the settler regime. So I want to be clear about that. And although I have included narratives by Palestinians, I don't feel like it is my place to speak in their name. I don't mean for this to undermine the indigenous, native, local narrative at all. In fact, I quote largely from Palestinian scholars. I make sure to give them presence in my text. But again, I had to be very conscious about how I approached this topic, and I'm very transparent about that. Regarding the biopolitical aspect, I get this question a lot because I've been doing biopolitics and one of my collections is actually about animal biopolitics, and so I don't go to it that much here because I kind of worked on it in several prior books, but I will say that just maybe briefly, that making life is really clearly at the heart, which is how Foucault kind of defines biopolitics. Making life and also letting die or making die in some instances is really at the heart of this project. Making life, i.e. deciding which animals and plants will live and which will die, even at the level of a species or a population, exactly the level that Foucault speaks about. So we're talking about even sacrificing individual animals, say the fallow deer, that at least at the beginning, more than half of the population would die during a reintroduction, and that it didn't matter as much as the survival of the population of the species. So we're talking, and I really look into it very closely in Animals, Biopolitics and Law in my book there. So I have had a lot of arguments with Foucauldians about whether biopolitics can be applied to animals or not, and you might want to check out that book because there I kind of go into depth into it. But I think that conservation is really essentially bio/necropolitical act, and it is about granting value and deciding, having criteria to decide who will live and who will die. You know, sometimes even exterminating certain animals.
Thanks, Sherrod. Suzanne.
Yes, thank you, Irus. I've never been to Israel, but it looks very beautiful. Thank you for those images. I think my question kind of builds on both Capano's and Cher's in some way, and something you just said is I'm going to come back to. You began and ended your presentation, you framed the presentation by alluding to the settler colonial state, the coloniality, the colonization framework, and you cited Patrick Wolf at the outset, the whole, settler colonial states erase to replace, right? That's what he argues. They eliminate to replace, and you mentioned it yourself when you cited him. And then I think what happened is in fact, I'm wondering if this is where you're arguing exploitation and elimination are linked, because then I think when you said that the Israeli state is expanding all the parks, including, I think I heard you say 40% of which are on private Palestinian land, it seems to me that perhaps you're saying the Israeli state is exploiting nature to further the settler colonial project. I don't know if that's how you see it, but I'm wondering if that's how you see it, or however you see what's happening in this settler colonial project and this expansion, this use of nature to sort of entrench the settler colonial project. I can totally respect and agree that it's not your place to speak for Palestinians, but what is it you want to say to Israel then? I mean, you're a settler from this colonizing space, and what basically, if you want to use a biopolitical model, what's your political message to your fellow Israelis about what's happening with this way of exploiting nature to further the project? Thank you.
Thanks, Suzanne. Really important questions. Thank you, all of you, I should say. So, yeah, I feel like the colonial mindset does exploit, take over, in this sense also as reserves for settlement later. So, I mean, there is protection on the one hand, but in many of these reserves, whereas one part will be saved, especially sometimes Palestinian villages, they would not be allowed to build, but then just a few meters down the line, the same kind of green spaces are given to Jewish settlers for construction. And so there's definitely this exploitation aspect, as you point out. And I feel like, yes, it goes to the heart. So there is a connection between capitalism and colonialism, really intricate and strong connection at the heart of both. And we're talking basically, they go hand in hand here. What I was more referring to is the exploitation of Palestinians, of the humans, although you're right that it's also the exploitation of nature, of animals, violence that incurs to both nature and non-human animals and plants. But I was more referring to the exploitation of Palestinian labor, because a lot of the critique of the settler colonial narrative or framework is that it doesn't highlight enough the neoliberal aspects of colonialism that are more highlighted in the classical colonial discourse. So what I'm saying here is that exploitation is there. There are economic interests at hand here. And my story about the Jerusalem parks very much gives an example of that, because they were commercialized. In fact, INPA handed over the management of one of the most important parks in Palestine, Israel. This is the City of David National Park, or Silwan, handed it to El-Ad, which is a right-wing group that's managing it for profit. The group is a nonprofit, but it's managing the park for profit. There's a lot of commercial interests at hand. So this is what I was talking about, exploitation of Palestinians as laborers without actually recognizing their role or even their existence. So as long as Palestinians are willing to continue to cultivate those beautiful terraces that I showed you there, then they're allowed to stay. This is the ecological native, so they're allowed to stay as long as they do that. So in that sense, we're talking about exploitation as well, and this is kind of why I say that those go hand in hand in the story. And I guess your other question about what I would say to Israel, well, like I said, I feel like it's pretty provocative to say right now that maybe it's obvious to all of you, but it's a pretty big leap of faith to say in this context that nature is political and is used for dispossession and for settlement, and a lot of people are very upset about this. The book is not even out, and I've been dealing with quite a few very upset people that I've worked with for 30 years who are very upset about framing it. Maybe I should have said in answer to Bronwyn that the settler colonial framework is very alien to most of them. They might describe certain things and describe the facts of but they won't want to call it that. And it feels like I'm imposing a narrative that doesn't seem to resonate with them. So I feel like, what am I saying? Well, I'm saying, first, let's recognize that this is the case, and then maybe we can do conservation differently. Conservation does not have to be colonial. There could be an unsettling of nature, unsettling of ecologies, and this is also why I use the term ecologies, because kind of drawing on Timothy Morton's idea of the ecological thought, of relationality, of this kind of coexistence, or as I call it in my book about coral conservation, I call it correlations. And so there could be a different kind of ecology or ecologies, not just the settler one. And so I'm hoping that this book will be one step in the process of recognizing how nature is utilized, perhaps toward a movement toward unsettling the settler ecologies. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for that question. We started a few minutes late, so I'll allow the conversation to carry on for maybe 2, possibly 3 more questions. We'll see how it goes. So Desiree and Andrea, so please go ahead.
Thanks. Thank you, Iris. Yeah, a lot. That really did raise a lot. I am very curious about this thing called nature and how you understand nature, how you define nature, because there's a sense in which the official Israeli understanding of nature is obviously very performative. I mean, the number of reserves out there, orchestrated. And it's almost as if this nature is a sort of a complementary complement to a sense of being Israeli. So I would just like to hear you say more about your understanding of nature, how you're using that, what kind of philosophical traditions you're drawing on in talking about nature.
So again, I'm an ethnographer, so thank you. This is great. So I don't define nature as a standalone. I work through and try to criticize some of the definitions of my interlocutors. And I will say that the INPA officials, a lot of them do hold this idea of a pristine kind of wilderness idea. And this is exactly at the heart of the critique that I present, because I say that exactly this juxtaposition between nature and culture, between humans and nature, is so problematic, because then it leaves, humans out of the picture. The local populations have to be removed from the parks, right? And this is at the heart of the colonial mindset. So I identified that this is how this pristine notion, this idea that camels cannot enter into the nature reserve. Whereas certain other ecologists will say, well, the camels co-produced the nature reserve. They've been part of this landscape, so even if they're not so-called wild, they still have a place. And so the binary is not as rigid. And I look into this question about the relationship between nature and captivity in my book Wildlife, the Institution of Nature. And I look into the difference between zoos and national parks, different ways of managing nature. And what underlies this very much so are different definitions of what is nature. And so I think generally I like to point out, to highlight the problems of seeing nature as this kind of pristine ideal. And that, as Donna Haraway calls it, it's important to speak about nature culture, and she speaks about it in one word. And so again, I've kind of written quite extensively about most of my work. It's not about Palestine, Israel, it is about the politics of conservation. And so I have kind of a central book there, Zooland, the Institution of Captivity, and then the sequel is Wildlife, the Institution of Nature.
My name is Andreas Freitag. I was a fellow here last year and I'm visiting. And I'm an economist, and this is important for my question, because you mentioned interests. And I think while I was listening, I thought you speak all the time political economy, not the language, but the substance. It's about vested interests. And I was wondering whether it would be more, I take this that you don't like the situation, you would like to improve the situation in different aspects of it. So my question is, would it be helpful if you step away from the moral position, not being immoral, but not claiming a moral position, but more discussing the whole thing from the perspective of interests? And who has what interests, and how can we instrumentalize interests in order to come to your morally superior position? That's my question.
I don't know if I would say morally superior. That frightens me a little bit. Superiority generally is, gets me a little jittery. Well, that's another book, not mine. Yeah, no, mine is a political book. I don't want to neutralize it. I've done enough of that. I'm at this point of my career that I want to put it out there. And it's interesting that you say that this is a political economy book, because it's that aspect of the book has been really challenging for me. again, kind of the economical aspects, because I do feel like, yes, there are those aspects, but there are also many other aspects. But I do agree that, that it's there. But again, I don't want to neutralize. I think there's enough naturalization and neutralization going on here without me adding to it.
Thanks.
But what is the price of proving the point?
Well, you get a framework within which you can judge it. Your moral position is absolutely in order and you can maintain it. But the point I want to make is to be substantially more successful for the case which I have understood you make. If you don't blame, if you look at the interest, and when I speak about political economy and economic interest, this is not only about GDP and money. And there's anything you can, we economists are very imperialist in that respect. So we look at any field of life from an economic perspective. So that's the point I want to make. So not more. I'm looking forward to read the book, and I will definitely do so. And but just as a thought.
Thanks, Andreas. I think we'll take one final question from the one Old Testament scholar I gather in the room. That's Louis, please.
Thanks for a very interesting talk, and you are brave, and that's on your surname, but I think what you are doing is certainly brave within the context of Israel-Palestine, so thank you for that. A short question. You mentioned the term biblical animals and also biblical plants. When I, as a Hebrew Bible scholar, hear that, I'm always suspicious about it. And not that I think that you used it neutrally, or that you sort of saw it simply as a literary source affirming that there were these animals in the past or in the ancient past. But is there some religious legitimacy in using that term, or is that the attempt also within the circles that you have investigated to use the term biblical in order to say something political and not simply something historical? And then just to conclude that, do you think that one can also speak of Quran animals?
Of what?
Of Quran animals, the Quran.
So definitely the biblical is political. And I tell the story of how sometimes the decision of which animal is biblical and which not was made, and sometimes it's based on Christian missionaries who came in the 19th century to this part of the other stories of colonization. And I guess I don't know why this is bringing me to Andreas, just to mention about your question about neutralizing. I think scientists, natural scientists, have done a lot of that, thinking that maybe their statements, I teach climate change, and this is kind of a lot of what I'm doing now, their statements will be more convincing if they use a neutral language. But in fact, I think we've found out that that's not the case, that in order to appeal to the public, people want to know where you're coming from in terms of your values, even if they don't trust you if you're not putting it up front. They might not agree with you, but I don't know if concealing it is the best way to go. And kind of back to the biblical, I don't know how that jumped in my head, because kind of that's some of my critiques about how scientists contributed in some ways to where we're at with climate change. I think, I don't know that I've seen narratives about the Quran, but I was studying the settler perspective, and so that might be the reason. And I will say that a lot of the conservationists that I've been interviewing are not religious at all. They actually, Neely, the vet, has kind of told me, I'm not doing it for biblical purposes. This is not my aim. In some ways, it's used for kind of PR, like selling it maybe to, I don't know, South African Jews or American Jews, but the conservationists, for the most part, or a lot of them, are secular. And they're doing it for the more cosmopolitan, I think that goes back to your question about global conservation, and for cosmopolitan ideas, they really want to protect, preserve species that are in decline. And so for them, the biblical is less important, although if it contributes to their funding, then why not, you know? So thanks for that.
Thank you, Iris. We can continue, but I think we should close. Apologies to Glenn and Soika, who also wanted to ask you questions, but I'm sure they'll catch you during our reception afterwards. So Iris, thank you very, very much. We look forward to the book.